This is Myth 8. And this is a storyteller's cane from West Africa, from Cameroon. And it's flexible. It has a head that is from ancient Egypt. This was the ancient Was scepter, and it was the royal wand, the baton of authority in ancient Egypt. And in West Africa, it is used as the storyteller's cane to establish his cadence. All myth is in a cadence that has a very special delivery. It is not just an oral language, but it is a woven language. Its patterning is traditional, and the tradition is rooted into ritual stepping, so that not only is there a myth in mythology, but there are chants in mythology as well. And there are prayers in mythology as well. And so the better term, instead of just the blanket term myth, is to call it the Mythic Horizon. And the Mythic Horizon is where language and images and feeling all flow in a dynamic. To consider that myth is a form is not exactly right, and it's premature. Myth is only a form when we have the idea of myth in our mind. A symbolic idea of myth has a form, but myth itself as a dynamic is a process and not a form. And because it is a dynamic process, myth flows in a parallel to nature, the way in which nature occurs, because nature is also dynamic. And we've seen in our learning that there seems to be a syncopation in the universe. And the syncopation is that out of a dynamic flow, forms will emerge, and not just emerge static or dead, but emerge iteratively. That is to say, they don't come out and are there, but they constantly, vibratorily occur. So form is a dynamic energy brought into an iterative focus. And we style that matter, but we know now quite conclusively that matter is energy. And one can take matter out of its form and put it back into energy, in which it becomes then a dynamic. So then in the universe there is such a thing as thermodynamics, the dynamics of heat, of temperature. But when it is brought into an annealed focus, one then has a matter like a star. And one can apply the laws of thermodynamics to the form as well. But what has happened here is that there are two different styles of energy. One is that it dynamically flows, the other is that it energetically cinches into form. So that these two characteristically had a specific, distinct delivery whenever there was a capacity for the mind to be able to make the distinctions firm in ideas. We have looked at a number of different sources of the human family, and we've looked at one of the most poignant moments, and that was classical Greece, when they discovered that their minds had literally gone off the map. that they had come into a certain style of mind where they were no longer capable of being natural at all, and they had become capable of being abstract to the point of isolation, of individual isolation, of societal alienation. And this happened in the 400s BC. And when we look at the 400s BC and classical Greece, we see for the very first time anywhere the birth of a style of oral delivery called Greek tragedy. And that Greek tragedy is poignantly the presentation of a mythic horizon that ends myth in an impossible alienation. An impossible alienation because the whole point of a Greek tragedy is not that it's tragic, but that one knew ahead of time that this was tragic, and no matter what you did, you could not escape it. And so the tragedy was not that something bad happened to you, that despite everything you do, it will still happen to you. And so there is a peculiar kind of a language used in Greek at the time. And the finest stylization of that language occurs in two writers, Plato and Thucydides. The birth of history, conscious history, and the birth of conscious philosophy, in the sense that it was now taught openly. And in Thucydides, one finds two words that are used specifically when he wants to talk about a process that you can do nothing about. He uses the term in Greek dynamis, out of which we get the term dynamic. But when he wants to talk about a formal energy, he uses the term energeia. And he means to say that when we make forms, just like when the universe makes existential forms, things, they have an energy to them. And that this energeia has a very specific kind of vibratory calibration. Just what it was 2,500 years ago, they were unsure in terms of our kind of science, but they were quite distinctly aware that something here is permanently understandable. How can one get to it? And so you find in the 400s BC in ancient Greece, for the very first time, one finds a different style of numeracy than one found any other place in the world. Up until then, everywhere on the planet, numbers, being literate in numbers, numeracy, was always stylized in terms of ritual. One knew 1, 2, 3, 4 ritually. All of a sudden, in the 5th century BC in classical Greece, numbers ceased to be ritual and they became symbolic. And as soon as they became symbolic, they were capable of an abstract dimension that was never there, because ritual forms coming out of nature have a natural emergent quality. Their iteration is completely natural, and one can learn from the natural world and learn to count in the natural world, and it holds. If you count 3 sheep and 2 goats, that 2 and that 3 are as natural and ritually objective as the goats and the sheep. But as soon as you come into numeracy in a symbolic way, symbolic numbers now become abstract and independent of nature. They don't emerge from nature. They emerge in the mind, but they emerge from a different dynamis. They emerge from the mythic horizon. And so symbolic numbers have a mythic origin, not a natural origin. And one of the deep qualities that became apparent at that time was that nature and culture, while they can be in parallel, they can also fall out of sync. And when they do, culture begins to fall more and more out of sync. It skews. And as it skews, the mind, which emerges from it, is skewed also without knowing that it's skewed. And so this became a very severe problem. It surfaced many places in the world about that time. It surfaced in India, and in the Indian experience of it, the ancient Vedic ritual quality coming out of nature, where one understood that Agni was fire, that one had Indra as the god of storms, and one understood then that this whole mythic development of the Vedas from the rituals, from nature, was all of a piece, and then all of a sudden, in the 5th century BC, all of this became suspect, just like in classical Greece. And so you have someone who appears like the classical Buddha, who is a radical departure, just like Thucydides and Plato in Greece, just like Aeschylus and Greek tragedy in Greece. Radical departure. The Buddha looks to see how is it that the mind can skew so far away that it becomes literally not only unnatural, but it becomes anti-natural. It becomes an enemy to nature, and thus becomes an enemy to life, and one literally has an involuntary taste for suicide. And so one had with Pythagoras and Plato and history and Greek tragedy, one had with the classical Buddha and those surrounding him, a radical take on the nature of nature and the culture of culture as two processes that obviously, when they go out of sync, they have no way of being put integrally back together again, because the mind that would naturally do this is incapable of understanding that it needs to do this. And so classically, a third process is brought into play. And the third process is vision. We call it vision today. Sometimes in antiquity and various cultures, it was called magic or the supernatural. The supernatural. It isn't nature, it isn't culture, but it's like nature, it's like culture, it's a process, but it is super. It's a super process. We today would understand it as consciousness. The process of consciousness, which must then be tapped in order for the integral ecology of nature to be reinstated, especially so that nature and culture as processes can be parallel again, so that the existentials that come out of nature and the thoughts that come out of the mythic experience can be aligned, and that their integral is such that one now is able to understand, yes, this is how this plays out, this is how this goes. And then again, the numbers and the natural qualities are aligned, and one then can not only speak straight, one can think straight. And so that third process, as we will see in our learning, that visionary consciousness, when it comes into play, it comes into play in a completely different mode from nature and experience. Nature and experience are always integrals. And the title today is called Variety, Integral, and Image, Meaning. And one of nature's ways of ensuring that the integral is the best possible is that variety is used, not as a differentiating quality, but as a style of the way in which integration works naturally. And with that variety, every indication of environment or condition becomes a quality of the way in which the variety plays itself out. And out of this will come an evolutionary development that this particular variety path works in this particular condition or environment. And if the environment is new, if the conditions are new, then all of a sudden one has the clustering of that style of variety, like in the history of this planet, when life first appeared on this planet, it was in the form of bacteria for about 2 billion years. And then all of a sudden, about 500 million years ago, it's called in paleontology now, it's called the Cambrian explosion. In the Cambrian geologic age, 500 million years ago, all of a sudden you had different kinds of conditions. You had emergence in the world for the very first time of cellular life, eukaryotes. And when cellular beings came into play, they were so successful, so fast, that one had this amazing variety of cellular life and development, and all of it leads to us. The bacteria are still here, and several other levels of life still here. But the integral has gone towards the cellular life. So nature works by variety, but still within an integral, and images work the same way. Images are always a varietal that goes towards meaning, which then again brings the integral back in. And so thought, literally, is the emergence of imagery into form. And so the mind has a very powerful form at its center, and that is the imagination. And in the mind, the imagination is definitely a form. It has a structure. It has an objectivity. But as we'll see, that quality of the mind is, to use an old mythic phrase, it's a movable feast. Because the imagination can be directed so that it goes outside of the mind. And as it goes outside of the mind, it shifts its mode. Instead of remaining integral, it becomes into the differential mode, into the process of consciousness. And when the imagination of the mind goes into conscious dynamis, it ceases to be a form and operates as if it were the whole gist of the process of consciousness, and you get creative imagination. And out of creative imagination will come a new style of form called art. But there's an exchange, as we will see, that happens. As the imagination goes into consciousness and becomes dynamically creative imagination, a quality of consciousness comes into the mind. And whereas in consciousness it was memory, when it comes into the mind, it acquires formal structure and becomes the memory. And now the mind, because it has a memory, is able to use a conscious dimension in helping to make the integral better, more refined. And it's in this way that the mythic experience becomes able to tap visionary consciousness. What we're looking at are several groups of human beings. One of them, the ancient Zuni Indians of the American Southwest. The other, West European high medieval people whose mythology was centered around King Arthur. We're looking at Arthurian mythology and Southwest Pueblo mythology, not to become anthropologists or become literateurs of some English class, but we're looking to try to understand how is it then that this mythic horizon works, because there seems to be no more disparate populations that we could tap than the Zuni Indians and the Chaucer Middle English Arthurians. And yet we find again and again that there are relational qualities that seem to be permanent because they belong not to those cultures in their environments, but they belong to culture as an experiential flow, as a dynamis in human experience. We started with the storyteller's cane, with the cadence of a mythology. And this cadence is also the cadence of chant. It is also the cadence of a particular kind of prayer. The Zuni prayer is very much a highly stylized prayer. And we have been looking at the way in which the Zuni people, they were studied by maybe a half dozen of the greatest American anthropologists, and out of them, 2 American women especially, taking their cue from a 3rd American woman who was the first great anthropologist of the Zuni. Her name was Mrs. Stevenson. And her husband ran the trading post, and she got interested in the people around. And she was a very pushy Victorian lady, and she did all sorts of things to defend the Zuni people, endearing herself to them. And so they took her into their confidence. And as soon as it became apparent that there was something to really know, that these were not just primitive people, but that they had a culture that was extraordinarily stylized, extraordinarily rich and complex. In fact, the Zuni are very much the pinnacle of the Pueblo peoples. The Zuni never numbered in historical times more than 2,000 people. But the complexity of Zuni culture is staggering, so that one has to look to the ancient Brahma Hindus or the ancient Jews or any kind of ancient people to find a complexity that matches it, even though one is talking about just a couple of thousand people. But it's a couple of thousand people that honed their culture over many thousands of years, close to 20,000 years, and had been in various venues of North America until they came to the American Southwest. And at the point of their emergence in that landscape we talked about last week was a sacred lake located actually in Arizona. And there by St. John's, that lake, we talked about it last week, is very much like Manasawar, the sacred lake in the Himalayas under Mount Kailas. It has a peculiar property. Here in California, the largest lake that has that property is Lake Tahoe. Tahoe means sky water. And when you are on the shore of Lake Tahoe, just before dawn, the quiet expanse of Tahoe is exactly the same tone and color as the sky. so that there is no way not to know that the lake is on Earth and is distinct from the sky. It looks exactly like the Earth has a hole in it and that the sky is here. So that the Earth is like a rather colossal illusion to normal life, that when one sees it in this balance of day and night, this balance of earth and sky, in this balance of one's calmness, seeing this, one has the distinct quality that really the earth is floating in an infinite sky, and that this is the place where everything emerges from. It's not just a hole, it is a gateway. It is a threshold of emergence from the infinite. So that one has the distinct quality then that our life is not rooted in the earth so much, is on the earth, but the earth is floating in an infinite sky. It's a mystical experience. And one can have this in many distinct ways. Not only at Manasawar, not only at Lake Tahoe, not only at St. John's in Arizona, but there are different ways in which this experience occurs, and that image becomes a transformer because it has a access immediately to a visionary consciousness which flows through that, so that the Hopi are absolutely convinced that the earth is a kind of a place that at some farthest margin of the earth there is a hole through which all emergence happens and through which one can go to other worlds, to other realms. Literally, one would today, in terms of space technology, say that this is the spiritual launching window. It's the spiritual launch window. And that one needs to go to the extremity of the earth, to the margin of appearance, and it is there at that threshold that one, for the first time, has not just access to this, but one has the view of it, the darshan of something that goes with natural variation, and that's called freedom. Not freedom of choice, freedom. Whitman, in his Democratic Vistas, the master of American poetic chant, he says in Democratic Vistas that nature seems to love two things equally. She loves freedom and variation. She likes all of us to be as varietal as possible and completely free. Not free to have choices, but free even of choice. Free. So that one is suspended in the real rather than just limited to the appearance. And out of this, in the high medieval, the way in which one talked about magical beings is that they were sky-wrapped. Their clothing was the sky. So that they were invisible, not because they were invisible, but because they were like that water of Manasawar or Tahoe. They were exactly real, and so they were invisible to eyes that were used to seeing only appearance. And this is a very curious thing that comes out in very high-powered yogas. When one looks out to the world, when one looks out to existentials, to appearance, the two eyes look out to focus. And the focus is constantly iterative and slightly shifting. And so we're used to seeing in terms of a focus, a multiple field of a constantly iterative focus. And usually when people go into meditation, when they're first in that or they're inexperienced, they look to see in their minds in the way in which perception sees. And so their conception is integrally limited. And even not just limited to the integral mode, they don't see differentially at all because it's invisible to them. But they see in a much funneled kind of an integral, which is very small indeed. One would, later on, you develop a lot of compassion because you realize this is universal. It happens to everyone almost all the time, and it takes a great deal of transformation in order to not habitually just do that. And what happens is when one turns the inner sight inward and really does that, a kind of a Lake Tahoe Manasawar happens. And one doesn't see individually focused, one sees all. Not an all, not an everything, just total. One time when he was being interviewed in the early 1950s, the great old Zen master, D.T. Suzuki, was being interviewed by a very young philosophy professor from MIT named Houston Smith. And Houston Smith at the time was in his 20s and very spry. And he was talking to D.T. Suzuki, who was nearly 90 at the time. And Houston Smith had this keisak. He says, well, in the Zendo, to keep you alert, they hit you. Is that true, Dr. Suzuki? That they try to wake you up with that? And D.T. Suzuki smiled at him, and you could see that he realized, though this man was a philosophy professor at MIT, in terms of meditation at that time, he was a child. And so D.T. Suzuki turned in a special kind of way. He was wearing glasses. And as he turned, the lights on the set glared, and his eyes were just luminous circles. And he said, well, that has to do with consciousness. It's not about being hit. It's not about hitting the body. One doesn't need to hit the body. One needs to awaken the mind so that it is open and stops grasping. And that its graspingness is a habituation carried over from the ritual level, which has been reduced because of a limited experience. And so the whole natural ecology, instead of having a flow, instead of having a dynamics where nature and culture flow, and out of the flow of nature one has existence and the objectivities of actions that are energized into form and become things, so that the actions that we perform, we can now make a stack. And we can do things that now have some kind of objectivity, and that the mind also has its symbolic objectivity. And because the symbols and rituals are able to be aligned, one can be able to now understand, oh, this is how the world works. This is how the universe works. This is how we work. This is how we happen. And that action now is ritual objective. But as culture skews, the action ceases to be just purely natural and becomes more and more dominated by the culture, and so the action now becomes karmic for the first time. Maybe the easiest way for us in our time to understand it becomes radioactive. So that every action that one does now has not a parallel with iterative emergence naturally, but it has more and more the snags of a karmic, and it becomes actually a cascade is the logic term for it, like a pachinko game. As soon as you put something in, it goes through all the little permutations and creates the cacophony. And because it is happening with hundreds of thousands and finally millions and finally billions of people, the world is actually a noisy place called Bedlam. There was a beautiful movie called The King of Hearts with Alan Bates, and in World War II, and he's a soldier, and he goes into this town to free it, and the only people left in the town, everybody else has fled, is the insane asylum. And in the insane asylum, they're all having a great time because they're out, everybody else is gone, and they're just having a wonderful time, and he's slowly becomes beloved by them because his craziness, he's a soldier, he thinks he's in a war, and they accept him. And then when the other troops come to take over the town, he goes with them back into the asylum. They close the door and they say, well, we'll just stay in here and have a good time. We'll just be human by ourselves. Those who look in and see all realize that there is a completely different ecology, the differential conscious ecology. It has a completely different mode. But it's a mode that is able to weave itself with the world, weave itself with nature. Consciousness is not an enemy of nature, not an enemy of culture. And the three, when they flow together, when nature and culture, the mythic horizon, and the differential consciousness flow together, the American Indians and the Buddhists and the Chinese all have a similar kind of a phrase for that. They call that the Great Way. The Mahayana, the Great Way. And that this Great Way has then a very curious kind of annealing effect. It makes culture now not just natural but also conscious, so that one has the Great Way in the stars, but one has the red road on earth. One is able to live the Indian way of being people, of being real. And that one isn't real simply because you're able to fit into your environment, but because one is able to fit in not just to the universe, but into the cosmos itself, the cosmos being a conscious universe. And so the myths now become extremely mature, and experience becomes mature. Imagery becomes mature. And the feelings begin now to have the appreciation for an enormous variety that in no way compromises the ability to be integral. And out of this comes the discovery of the individual. And time again, human beings have discovered that they had gone through an era where no one was able to be individual. And that all of a sudden now, it is now again possible to do this. When individuality occurs, it occurs in the mind as the idea of oneself. But when one adds consciousness to that, the creative imagination allows for the development of a spiritual person. It's like an art form, and emerges out of not a four-dimensional natural space-time, but out of a five-dimensional quintessential conscious space-time, so that the spiritual person is actually a form that emerges out of a five-dimensional process. And that quintessence to it is in the way in which language, which has had its cadence mythically, acquires its grammar and syntax symbolically, and now transforms and becomes a magical language, where what one says has the ability to transform what is. And now, for the very first time, the universe becomes a cosmos that has another quality to it. Possibilities are now real. All possibilities are real. Let's come back. Let's take a break. Let's come back, and let's come back to our orientation. We're in a learning that has several levels of syncopation. One of the levels in the syncopation is to establish a definite form by aligning iterative presentations into a set of 12, and then to put a 13th at the end of that set, but the 13th as not a 13th of the set, but as an interval which articulates the set into a different way of presenting itself. If you have a line, alignment, and then you make a group out of that, and you make that into a set, there are many things that you can do with that. But when you put an interval with that, not a part of the set, but the ancient way of understanding it was that it was an aspirant. It was not a part of the letters, but it was a breath put into the pronunciation of the letters so that the word became sacred. For instance, in the Zohar, in the Book of Splendor, even though it is Jewish, it is Jewish mysticism. And when they have the name of Yahweh, it is not just the 4 letters making Yahweh, but there's an aspirant in the middle that is not written, but is always said, not said out loud so much, but said in the pause of the body, so that the breath itself, without sound, is a part of the name. And thus, the name shifts from being a designation with connotations to becoming a presentation with infinity. It's a whole different order. So that when we add the interval to the set, it changes to a phase. And the phase is an aspiranted stage, which has many other aspects that it can absorb beyond that of set theory, a group theory. One then gets into creative, imaginative kinds of ratios, proportions, structures. Our learning has 8 phases. And the first 4 phases are all in an integral ecology, and the second 4 phases are in a differential ecology. And they're able not only to overlap, if they were just geometrical overlapping. One has then a quality of math that was developed in the 19th century by a man named John Venn. They're called Venn Diagrams. Now that came finite mathematics, very useful. Almost all graph presentations in the 20th century are all based on Venn diagrams. We're not talking about plane geometry. We're not even talking about complex spherical trigonometry. We're talking about a cosmic scale of mathematique that has a poetic that is very close to it, in fact, is a harmonic of it. And when you have an analytic that is a harmonic of a poetic, the ability of that being to learn becomes unbounded. Not that there are no forms, there are plenty of forms, but that the forms and the processes have a symmetry to them. And because it is symmetrical, one is able to deal with processes, as dynamics, and not confuse them with forms. This is the beginning of very high intelligence. To understand that existentials are forms, but nature is not a form. That the mind is full of ideas that are objective forms, just like existential things. But that experience is not a form at all. It's a process. It's a dynamic. And so one has to treat it in a different way. One doesn't look for the structure of experience. One doesn't look for the structure of nature. One appreciates the process flows in nature. The process flows in experience, and out of it comes a whole different quality. What comes out of experience then is that when one has stopped looking for a psychological structure to experience, what comes out of it is the possibility for the first time of sentience, of being wise in feeling. And when one is wise in feeling, intelligence, the mind's structure of knowing meaning comes into play in a completely different way. Now, this is 21st century. It's also ancient wisdom. For the Hopi people, someone who is really rich is rich because they have a quality of knowledge about how the supernatural works in nature. And this is due to the way in which the mythic language of the Zuni people. That mythic language has not only its myth stories, the mythos, the dynamic plot line of the story, so that one doesn't analyze the structure of the story so much as that one learns to hear the story and to tell the story in terms of experience. And out of that acquaintance, that woven oral language, comes a sentience that then allows the emergence of a different quality of mind. One would then call that the completed mind. The integral mind then is definitely a completion, but it's not a completion in the sense of closing it off. It completes itself in a very interesting do-si-do. Its do-si-do is that it now is completed by an openness, and that openness, like that Lake Tahoe, Manasawar, pure lake of the sky, openness, now consciousness becomes a part of nature, but not co-opted by nature in the integral, but allows the free play of the transforms of the differential consciousness all the way through nature. Sometimes in ancient wisdom it's called the soul corridor. The spirit is able to play on any level up and down that soul corridor. In the Renaissance, the figure who presented it most eloquently was Pico della Mirandola in his little book on the dignity of man. He said when all of creation had been finished, man was created not to be a thing like other things in nature, but he was given the mobility to go on that soul corridor of all creation, everywhere, on every level. He is at home. That's why he doesn't inherit property. He inherits the house of the universe. He's at home everywhere. He's family. There's a difference. There is a deep quality in this that goes back even to Paleolithic wisdom. In the southern Salisbury Plain area of England, where there's Stonehenge, and Avebury, there's also a place called Silbury Hill. And Silbury Hill was a mystery for many people until a young British archaeologist named Michael Dunn one day was out there on Silbury Hill. It's just a hill, just a mound, with a little rim around the base of it. And what use was it? There was never a structure there. He was there in a torrential downpour, and he stayed on top of Silbury Hill And as the rain collected, at the base of Silbury Hill, where the little berm went around, the rain collected and formed a little temporary lake. And when the rain cleared, the sky cleared, as it will in England for a little bit, there was Silbury Hill floating in the reflection of the sky. And he suddenly realized that Silbury Hill was shaped like a breast. This was the breast of the earth suspended in the sky water that one only saw from the vantage point of receiving the nutrition of that vision at the crest of the hill after a rainstorm. One had to be there at that moment because quickly the ground soaked the water. It was invisible again. It was only there at that threshold of that place. Our learning takes us through thousands of these kinds of thresholds. But it is not apparent if you just bounce off it. If you come to get something, to take something away from it, you're going to miss the rainstorm. The way Fuxi found the trigrams 5,000 years ago was watching a thunderstorm in the mountains, how it happens, how it really occurs, and occurs in its phases. And he saw that indeed there are 8 phases to this, like the 8 notes of an octave. But in that there's always a special little do-si-do. The 8th note in the octave is the same as the first note, but 1 registry higher. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Re, mi, fa. And so one has to learn that there is a bit of, not an overlap or a stagger, but there is an ordinal quality that comes into play when cardinality is grouped into a set. And the ordinal gives it powers. And there is a threshold after which, if one goes through 4 sets of ordinality, the 5th set becomes a differential, works in a different way, like the opposable thumb. All of a sudden, one now has an ability to do things that you couldn't do before. This is an important thing. We take 4 presentations and we group them. And the way that we keep them grouped is that we tie them very loosely with books. And the reason we use books is because we've used books the last aeon. The last 2,000 years have been the aeon of books. No, we're not going to use them in the future that way. But in order for us to understand the culture, the civilization, the mind, ourselves, everything around us, we have to use a book calibration partially because that's how it was formed in the first place. And it'll be incomprehensible without that. And we won't be able to go to the next ordinal without having saturated that first. So we use pairs of books. If we used a single book, we would have a text. A text is by now, a habitually ingrained ritual reduction. So we use a pair that are seemingly unrelated, and we bring them together in terms of a ratio, in terms of a proportion, so that now we have something, it's not a fraction, but it's a ratio. And now we have the ability to use books in a transformative way that they were hardly ever used before. Now we have just come to Myth 8, which means that we've finished the second set of 4, the second pair of books, and we're coming up now, Myth 9, 10, 11, 12 will be a third pair. A new ratio. So we start next week with a new ratio. One of the books that we're going to use is by the great female anthropological genius, Mary Douglas. We're going to use her little book, How Institutions Think. Mary Douglas, in her late 80s, is one of those geniuses. She wrote a book about 50 years ago called Purity and Danger. She took anthropological methods and applied them to housework. What is behind this whole thing of applying Lysol to kill all the germs, all the bacteria, so that one is now safe because all life has been evaporated from your house? What is going on here? Your children may only do such and so if they do anything else that's dirty? What kind of abstract nightmare is being promulgated here? And out of it, she wrote another book called Natural Symbols. And she edited a book called Rules and Meaning because she got deep into this whole thing. And she got teamed up with the Sage Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation in New York City, and did many monographs for them on work and on business. And how is it that we have come to such a truly neurotic, almost psychotic, phobic misunderstanding of how to deal with each other? So we're going to use her, how institutions think. Because institutions do not have sentience. So how they think is definitely a problem for us. If we are swallowed by them, co-opted by them, and we pride ourselves because we have fit into them, oh my goodness. And paired with that, we're using a Chinese word called, it's been translated as monkey. Its real title is the Shiyu Qi, and its best translation is Journey to the West. All the great Chinese novels are from the Ming Dynasty, about 400, 300 years ago. And this is the finest novel of the Chinese Ming. It's The War and Peace of China. It's about a journey to the West to find the truth about reality by going all the way through the Gobi Desert, across China, into India to get the Buddhist sutras and bring them back. And a monk had done that. His name was Xuanzong. And at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, he went for years and years and years and years. And his journey was catastrophic in the adventures, the weirdness. He walked the whole way and walked the whole way back and brought back many of the original sutras from India. And he did this at the founding of the Tang Dynasty because the founder of the Tang Dynasty, Tang Tai-tsung, was one of the greatest figures in Chinese history. But he wanted to set up the Tang Dynasty so it would not make the dynastic mistakes that had been made again and again in China. They'd already had many dynasties, and all of them failed. And so the Tang was set up specifically to have a magical dimension from the beginning. Not just the Buddhist material, because the strategy of Tang Tai-tsung was huge. He wanted the Buddhist material from India to bring into play with all of the other insight conscious traditions that were there already in China, like Nestorian Christianity was very viable. There are many kinds of, there are even Jewish traders. The city of Kaifeng had a huge Jewish caravan population. There were many qualities. What had not happened, though, was that they were never brought into a great transform with Chinese traditions, not the Confucian tradition, but the Taoist tradition. And so Tang Tai-tsung wanted all of these. The missing piece was the real Buddhist text. They had all kinds of Buddhist texts for centuries. They were all confused, and the translations no one really knew. And it wasn't to bring Buddhism to China, but to bring the last missing element into the mix so that the Chinese Taoist tradition could go into a transform of all the world's wisdoms. And of course it happened just like that. And the person who did that was one of the greatest figures in planetary history. His name was Huineng. And he's known in Buddhist history or Chinese history as the sixth patriarch. He's the creator of the sudden illumination school. You don't have to go through lifetimes karmically. When you understand karma, you can short it out now, instantly. If you short it out by going into the interval that occurs, always there, you pull the zero out of the hat and you put it into an ordinal so that all of the illusion collapses because it all was just a deck of cards anyway. True Alice in Wonderland ending. Yes, they were all clear and they were all clearly arranged. And the arrangement was just a house of cards. A little bit of breath, you've got more dandelions. It's a completely different thing. And so the journey to the West and how institutions think are our next pair for the next 4 presentations. And we're not trying to learn Chinese literature. We're not trying to learn anthropology or sociology. We're learning how to learn by continually opening ourselves up both to structure and to process in a syncopation, and that those two have a larger syncopation of integral and differential, and that all of this together has not only completeness, but it has a perfection as well. And part of the completeness is to be open to the possibility of perfection. Because without that, one thinks that one simply knows. And just knowing that you know is not quite enough at all. It's a very bad habit. Lenny Bruce once in a skit in San Francisco in the 60s was deep into a skit, and he said, well, if I don't know, someone on my staff will. So we have an opportunity to take a look here. We're looking at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Zuni Indians, and there's a quality about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight we need to bring out, and that is the symbol of the Hermetic Star, the pentacle. When we look at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and we come to the description of this Hermetic Star, of this pentacle, pentangle, 5-pointed star, it reads like this. Then they showed him the shield. This is Sir Gawain's shield, and every knight had his own symbol that was on his shield. It was on the livery of his horse. It was the seal, symbolically, of his sentient commitment to an experience mode of being in service in a chivalric way, of being in service so that one had the ability of a warrior, but you didn't use it to kill. You used your ability as a warrior to protect. And that the protection was not to claim someone, but to offer one's protection out of a courtesy. So that the courage of a warrior and the courtesy of a lover were woven together with a third element like an aspirant, and that is one was open to a mystical transform of one's courage as a warrior, one's courtesy to the other. and that could be opened up to include then not just that beautiful other, but all others. One would be a protector of all sentient life, and one would be committed to doing this out of courtesy. And out of this, one recognizes that the code of chivalric knighthood on this level is that of the Bodhisattva of Mahayana Buddhism. Very, very, very interesting. And one wonders, well, how does the Bodhisattva ideal of Mahayana Buddhism get into the high medieval Arthurian ethos? Until one realizes that this goes back almost to the beginning. The way that Mahayana Buddhism developed in the very first place was around 90 AD in northern India, and it focused on a man named Ashvaghosha. In Sanskrit, when you pronounce it Ashvaghosha, it literally means the horse neighing. Someone is like a knight, only he's a knight of wisdom truth. Ashvaghosha. In his little book, the Shraddhapada Sutra, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. And you never find in India anywhere the use of the term faith. Faith. Well, faith is like, belongs to Christianity, isn't that right? Or belongs to Judaism. And in fact, that word in India is introduced to India by a Hellenistic Jewish Christian named Thomas. Thomas went to southern India around 41 AD. And out of that, within 50 years, you had the birth of the Mahayana, a completely different transform. Is the Hellenistic Jewish Christian transform of the Buddhist transform of Vedic, and so you get a double transform. And when you have a double transform, you get a different quality. If you have one transform, the water becomes wine. If you have a second transform, the wine becomes cognac. It's a completely different depth. We're verged to have a third transform. We're going to have a cognac that you can sip spiritually and not have to taste it physically at all. It'll still be there, still work. But we need to learn how to prepare ourselves to be there for that. And there isn't any tradition that is there to do that. That's why all this work. The best edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the one that I'm using, Marie Boroff's, but there is one by J.R.R. Tolkien. And a lot of Tolkien's genius comes in Lord of the Rings because he was the great professor at Oxford University and did the great edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And when he paired that with the Kalevala from Finland, you get in Lord of the Rings a quality that belongs to fairy tales and not to mythology. And when we get to the second year of our education, one of the year-long readings that'll be offered is that of Lord of the Rings, as well as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. We need year-long readings because the pairs of books would lose their cardinality, lose their set capacity if we didn't give it a traction of its kind. And so there's an architecture going on here. It's called in ancient wisdom architecture of the real. In order for these not to diminish themselves into texts in a rote way, we keep them paired. But in order to keep the pairs tuned, those pairs are tuned because of a year-long traction of a background that allows that to be. It's like in the tarot deck, the major arcana of the tarot deck. the 3 sets of 7 would never be able to keep that particular cardinality and ordinality if it weren't for the Fool card, which is the 0, which is behind all of them. And so you have to arrange the 21 cards in 3 sets of 7 against the 0 card, which gives it the intervaling, which gives it the aspirant quality, so that the forms don't get reductive and stay cooperative with the processes. There is no way to even have an arithmetic without understanding that it isn't just 1 + 1 = 2. The plus and the equals are processes more than forms. They're dynamics. And when you have the forms in the dynamic, now you have something that is real. And when it's real like that, and one gets calibrated to that, now your whole comportment becomes literally realistic for the first time. Not realism, which is the mental version of it, which atrophies and skews without its even knowing that it's doing so. But real. The pentacle, the Hermetic Star, comes from the ancient Mideast. The first time that it appears on pottery from Ur in southern Iraq some 5,000 years ago. It is a way of showing that one is not looking just at stars as points of light, but one is looking at them in terms of forms, of a line which in its convolution, it never leaves the plane, never leaves the page. It is always there in that plane, but its shiningness has a quality of the resonance coming out. This is like a bell, which insight coming into play with it rings it, so that the star's vibrations now come out, and each vibration is itself a complete star. In physics, it's called the principle of the Soliton. When you strike a bell, every vibration of that bell is a complete bell. It's not just one little bit of that vibration. If you have a room full of cellos, and they are all tuned, and you pick up one cello, and you play a B flat, every cello in the room will resonate B flat. It's a part of the real. And so when there is a population of people who have learned to learn, who are prepared to be prepared, the truth of any one of them will be known by all of them. Not low-class telepathy, real. Then we will have a humanity ready for the stars. Then they showed him the shield with its shining gules. Gules are designs, medieval word for designs, with the pentacle in pure gold depicted thereon. He brandished it by the baldric. That's the haft of the sword. And about his neck he slung it in a seemly way. So he took his sword, and this is a salute, and then he slung it. You've seen Toshiro Mifune with his sword slung, and other heroes. He slung it in a seemly way, and it suited him well. And I intend to tell you, though I tarry therefore, why the pentacle is proper to this Prince of Knights. Prince, in this way of talking, is not a prince like a junior king. A prince means the first. Comes a principle or princeps, it means the first. It means that if this knight is successful doing it, every other knight will be able to do that because the way is open. Once that way is open by any one of us, it is now open. The universe loves us in that way. I remember the first man to run under 4-minute mile, Roger Bannister, who was so overcome by having shattered the threshold that he collapsed into the arms of people afterwards. And within a couple of weeks, there were people running a sub 4-minute mile all over the place. How many people go up to the top of Mount Everest now? Every year. And yet when it was first done, when Sir Edmund and Tenzing were up there, it was an unbelievable thing for them. And as Sir Edmund Hillary said, years later after his wife had died, he went back to where they had built schools for these people, and he was still able to see in Tenzing's eye exactly what one would see at Manasauar or Lake Tahoe or Silbury Hill. The transparent openness between two people who had opened the top of the world, the crust of the planet, to everyone else permanently. It's the same way of Armstrong and Aldrin going to Luna and stepping there for the first time and opening the fact that the translunar realm of the universe is now open to us. We've given ourselves the invitation, and Mother Nature rather likes it. She's interested to see. It is a symbol which Solomon conceived once, to betoken true faith which it is entitled to, for it is a figure that has 5 points, and each line overlaps and is locked with another, and it is endless everywhere, and the English call it, as I have heard, the endless knot. Goes back to Solomon, but one looks to see Solomon's star, and right away what comes into play is the Jewish star has 6 points. But it's not called Solomon's star, it's called the Shield of David. The Shield of David. Oh, wait a minute, shield? Like knights have shields? Where does this come from? And one has to go to Gershom Scholem in his little collection of essays, The Messianic Idea in Judaism. And one finds in here a section called The Star of David, History of a Symbol, and one comes to understand that there was no Shield of David, there's no Star of David in Judaism in ancient times. The symbol of Judaism was the menorah. And before that, it was the black-haired donkey going back to 2000 BC, which was the caravan, the source of income for the people. This Jewish star, the Shield of David, comes in the 1600s. Very recent. What is going on here is that there is a misunderstanding confusion of ideas that are literally uncooked. The Zuni word that means that man is made by God and is fully cooked. Is exactly right. There was a beautiful saying one time that the different races come from the different cooking times in the oven of creation. And so there's a whole variety of temperatures and times involved, which just shows that God is a great chef. and not at all to be suspected of anything other than greatness. There is a great deal here. One aspect of this learning is that the oral language that's being used is not just put into sequence, but is woven so that the tapes that are available are meant to be adjuncts so that one can play them a couple of times during the hiatus, during the week, before the next live presentation, so that one gets one's ear in. It's like a musician that learns to play a certain kind of style. And once you hear Duke Ellington's orchestration, you never again mistake it for someone else. That's the A train that I like to hear. Thank you very much.